My guest today is Heidi Kingston. She is a journalist and she has traveled around the globe to the world's worst trouble spots. And I'm looking forward to our conversation with her. Heidi, welcome.
Thank you, Mukesh, and I'm very much looking forward to talking to you again.
Now, Heidi, you're a foreign correspondent, which is a well recognized niche of journalism, but one that is, I've always found, somewhat oddly labeled. It's a bit akin to saying that Columbus discovered America and beforehand the continent was terra incognita. Is there not a bit of arrogance involved in setting yourself up as an interpreter of exotic places and events to titillate your domestic audience? Or am I being unfair?
I'm going to say that I think you are being a bit unfair. So, I never really set myself up as an interpreter of exotic places, but as a journalist, my job is to report what I see. And I think when I was growing up as a Canadian, everything was exotic. We traveled to Europe regularly when I was a child, and I was happiest either in a plane or discovering somewhere new. But I also wanted to explore different cultures and languages and lands, and that has only continued. But I never thought of setting myself up as anything. Of course, the best way to be a journalist is to tell human stories. And I remember starting out as a reporter, I would be sent out to do doorsteps, which is kind of like the lowest of the low. And you knock on people's doors who had just been in the news for one reason or another. Often it was about tragedy. And to my surprise, people often wanted to talk and tell their stories and have them acknowledged. And you hear that a lot when you talk to people about genocide. So I think you may or may not like my writing, but so far no one has ever called me arrogant. And I think the foreign chorus label is just because you go to places that are foreign to where you're from.
Of course, your website has an impressive array of your prolific contributions to many leading newspapers all over the world in Europe, in America, Middle East, and so on. But I read somewhere where you said that you saw journalism also as storytelling. We want journalists to report the facts, not to make stories, especially in this day of so much misinformation. What do you think about that? Can a journalist actually be a storyteller?
Yes, but I don't think that because you tell a story, you don't deal with the facts. In fact, I think being a journalist is fundamental to stay true to the facts, and especially at this time. And it's always very disillusioning when people say, "Oh well, journalists make things up." I have to say, I've never made things up. Certainly not knowingly. Yes, I can do both. The way you can tell stories that are important and sticking to the facts is to make them interesting, but not to embellish anything.
Now, I was actually intrigued by your series on the worst places in the world, I believe you called it. What were these worst places, and what's your definition of a suitably horrid place that your publishers would actually bother to pay you to write about?
Okay, so as you know, Mukesh, journalists don't make up the headlines. That was something my editor had suggested, but it was actually after I had written the pieces. I had been to Mali to write about river blindness, and then I was in Bangladesh in Cox's Bazar, and I wrote about tragic situation of the Rohingya refugees who were the undocumented Rohingya living in absolutely terrible circumstances and in limbo. And then I spent a few days in the DRC, as you know well, the humanitarian crisis there. And then I visited Kibera, which is Africa's largest slum, which is in Kenya. And then I was in Darfur well after you, after the genocide. But I went to Darfur and talked to a number of people. And then as I was leaving, Omar al Bashir, the former president, was indicted by the ICC, which gave me a great opening line. So, what are the worst places in the world for me? It's because they are countries where there are human rights abuses, there's violence, there's war, conflict, violence against women and children, torture, famine, discrimination, corrupt politicians, all those things that we have, I think, an impulse and a duty to report. Now, I also love these places. I mean, I loved Rwanda and I had a fantastic time in Khartoum, but they are the worst places or described as the worst places because there is so much poverty and discrimination, I guess.
Now, well, one of the places which I know is very, very close to your heart is Afghanistan. It features heavily in your life, and your book, Dispatches from the Kabul Café, is a riveting take on the many weird and wonderful characters prancing mysteriously on stage and shuffling off into the shadows. And it's vivid also because myself spent some time in Afghanistan and I recognized many of the characters. It's also an engagingly intimate memoir of your own character developing as you navigate this weird bunch of characters ranging from peacekeepers to pawnbrokers, mercenaries to humanitarians, heroes to freeloaders, saints to sinners, and if I may dare to say, also some lovers. Meanwhile, we know that Afghanistan is horribly suffering under the Taliban, especially its women. But I found your book somewhat hedging its bets on whether or not Afghanistan has benefited or been worsened by our Western involvement. Do you think you have the answer now?
I think that the book really started in 2007 and was published, I guess it was published in 2015. So things were still a bit fluid. And I think I was trying to chronicle that sort of weird moment in time in Kabul where things, it was the tipping point. Which way was it going to be? I mean, I fell in love with the country and there was still a moment of hope. But if you were to ask me now, I would say that the intervention was overall a disaster because 20 years on, the Taliban are back and they are stronger than ever and they regain control so quickly that I think we sort of need no further proof that the occupation was a failure. Now, were there some good things? Women learning about their rights, boys and girls going to school, the notion of freedom and education, perhaps a taste of freedom. And I think I met a woman, I did a story out in, I can't remember, I think it was Helmand. She was growing vegetables in her garden and she got a little screen just to keep the insects off. And just her pride in being able to do this and sell her goods at the market and support her family and make, a contribution was so wonderful. I mean, it was a very low budget thing, but it was amazing. Yeah, I think what happened is terrible. We were distracted by Iraq, and by the time we came back to Afghanistan, it was too late. And I don't know, it's taken Afghanistan so many years to change. Like, I think it was 100 odd years ago that the king tried to bring in reforms, the Soviets tried to bring in reforms, and it just never seems to work, which is, I think, tragic for the women and the men who want to have a better life.
Well, I think it's fairly clear from what you say that we both agree that probably we as outsiders haven't done Afghanistan any great favors. What about the other way around? Has Afghanistan done you any favors? Have you changed as a person because of your months and years spent in Afghanistan?
Well, as I said, I fell in love with the country. I sort of arrived in a miserable February winter's day. And then as I was there for a few weeks, all of a sudden it became like spring and it was so beautiful. And I loved the people and I loved going around the country. And of course, it's different growing up in Canada because we don't really have any connection to Afghanistan as opposed to being in the UK, where, of course, we do have a great connection to Afghanistan. So it opened up a whole new world to me. Did it? Yeah, I think it did change me. I'm not quite sure how, but it certainly was a place that I felt I had to go back and live in and be part of. And of course, I just loved writing stories, whether it was about, women and drugs or, the politics or whatever it was. Everything was fascinating. It's a truly unique country, for better or worse. And yeah, I think it did. I think going to Africa for the first time also had a profound change in me.
Then you moved on and you turned to matters genocide. What brought that along?
It's sort of a continuation, I guess. When I was young, we went to Germany as a family holiday, and my parents and I went to Dachau. And I have to say that nothing ever shocked me quite as much as seeing Dachau, and that was seared into my soul. And then many years later, I was in Toronto just before COVID and met a woman at a small party who ran a charity called Project Abraham, and they were helping Yazidis fleeing ISIS resettle in Canada. And when I was talking about this and said, I might like to do something on this, the woman who started the charity said, you must meet Paulette Volgese. She's the daughter of Holocaust survivors, and she is helping teach these, mostly young women to speak English and navigate life in Canada. And what I liked was that arc between those two genocides. So I wrote a story and then I wrote a few more articles for the article. And I met a publisher at a Christmas party who said, I'd like you to write a book on it. And that took me down whole new rabbit hole because you can't write about genocide without writing about Raphael Lemkin, coined the term genocide in 1944. And you can't write about Lemkin without writing about the Armenian genocide of 1915, which inspired his lifelong career to find a word to describe the killing of lots of people. And that was the high watermark of barbarity until Hitler came along. It led to the book. I hadn't really started out writing about genocide, although it was always something I was personally interested in. I went to Daha, I went to Rwanda, I went to Cambodia, to Israel. So I'd seen a bit, but I'd say it was a flow. But that's how it started out. Like most things in my life, it was serendipitous.
From a chronicler of horrid places, you turned into a passionate anti genocide activist through your writing.
Well, I think I'm going to say two, but I think Rwanda was shocking simply because, we heard General Dallaire say, the genocide was coming, and I'm sure other people as well, but that sticks in my mind. And no one listened because, of course, if they did, they would have to act. And Mandela was becoming president of South Africa at the same time. But we saw this unbelievable barbarity unleashed in 100 days. As you know, neighbor against neighbor, wife against husband, whatever it was just horrendous. And it was there in front of us. I think the Holocaust is still fascinating, which is perhaps why we have such an industry of movies and books and series, etc. You can't get enough Nazis because it was just so industrialized, and it was as if utter madness had taken control of the country, which I suppose was true in Rwanda as well, and every other place. But those are the two that stick in my mind.
But is this fascination with the genocide, is there an element of vicariousness about observing, when we watch horror movies sometimes, and we are shocked and yet fascinated by seeing events unfold on our TV screens? So, is there a vicariousness around the genocide, which is perhaps a less pure emotion than feeling sorry for the victims?
Possibly. I never think we have totally pure motives. I think that once I went to Dachau, there was always like, well, could this happen to me? Or would I save somebody? I think that was it. And I think once I started to write the book, it was, the motive of the book wasn't anything other than to write the book, but it became clear that people hadn't learned the lessons and that maybe yet another book, because there are millions of them and millions of good ones like yours, could maybe make one tiny little bit of difference. I would say it was less vicarious than trying to almost a sort of self-protection. I just couldn't, as I said, I was, 12 or something when I went to Dachau, and I just couldn't quite comprehend it. I think that was it. The fear that, this could happen to me or somebody I know, and then, we saw it in lots of far off lands and not so far off lands.
Well, only in the last few days, as we talk now, there are terrible reports out of the killings in both Gaza and the atrocities in Darfur. Cries of genocide are now commonplace. Almost any war, and there are plenty of them going around at the present time. So, do you think the language of genocide has lost its meaning nowadays? And does it help or hinder our search for humanity?
Once again, as typical Canadian, two sides. I definitely think it's been diluted and used as a weapon of propaganda. Somebody said a sword drawn against an enemy. And it is a highly emotionally charged term. People often don't understand it's a legal term. And one of the things that I discussed in my book, which I don't think I had realized until I started to write it, was, it always seemed that genocide was the crime of crimes and the worst genocide, and the worst type of murder in the world. But crimes against humanity are probably equally terrible. And, there can't be a hierarchy of atrocities, really. So it's lost its meaning a little bit, but it's still, I think, a really important term. And we have to keep calling out genocide and telling these stories until everyone hears them and knows exactly what they mean.
I guess that's why we have so many remembrance days for this and other genocides. Srebrenica, Rwanda, the Holocaust, of course, Armenia, Cambodia, and so on. What's the point of these commemorations? Undoubtedly, we'll lay flowers, we make speeches, light candles, and there's plenty of activism going around genocide. And it goes round and round. So, what's the point?
Well, it's certainly good that people are engaged and are concerned about what's going on. There may be too many commemorations, but I think they are important. It's like marking an anniversary has a psychological impact. I think it's a natural impulse to remember and commemorate, and we can't stop remembering just because there are too many things to remember. And I think it's important, especially for, I'm going to say, victims, survivors, that they are acknowledged. So, yes, and it gives us something to remember and to talk about. So I'm going to say, when I look at it, I do think it's important.
Heidi, I sense that you are a serious journalist, but we live in a world where attention spans are getting shorter and shorter, where the world is more and more complex, and reporting accurately on what's going on requires nuancing. So, how do you grapple with that in terms of not dumbing down your journalism and your reporting, but in terms of enlightening accurately?
Well, I wish I had the answer. I think we are living in extremely challenging times, and I'm not sure what the future holds. But what is at least positive is there is so much information out there, like this podcast, so many other podcasts, proliferation of books and magazine, online magazines, etc. But I think it's very, very difficult. I mean, I've seen, like with my book, for example, it is aimed at the sort of general reader. So people will get a taste of what's out there, and it's, not too long. But I don't know. I mean, I remember speaking to, an ex-professor at MIT who was saying, well, AI is going to take over and there won't be any need for journalists or, doctors or lawyers soon. And that might be the future. I still think there are a lot of really fantastic journalists who do analyze stuff, and there are important platforms. But with this world of disinformation, and you look at Trump, who just lies about everything, and nobody seems to care, or none of his supporters seem to care. The rest of us do. It's very challenging, and I don't know what the answer is, except like everything else, we have to keep changing and fighting. We can never compromise on the truth. That is for sure the one thing. My favorite quote, I think, is the last line from The Great Gatsby, and it's also what's written on F. Scott Fitzgerald's headstone, which is, "So we beat on, boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past."
An optimistic and defined note on which to end, and appropriate. Thank you very much, Heidi, for talking to me.
Thank you, Mukesh. This was fabulous.